The letter arrived on a crisp spring morning, the kind of morning that should have felt full of promise, full of possibility, full of everything I had spent my entire life working toward, but instead, it would become the last moment I would ever feel like the world was still fair. I had been waiting for weeks, checking the mailbox every single day like some desperate kid waiting for a Christmas present that might not come, my stomach twisting into knots every time I opened the little metal door and saw nothing but junk mail and disappointment staring back at me. But today was different. Today, there was an envelope with my name on it, thick, official-looking, carrying the weight of my entire future inside it. And as I tore it open with shaking hands, I felt that brief, fleeting moment of joy that comes right before a disaster hits. "Congratulations," the letter read, the words practically glowing on the page as my eyes scanned over the details, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words I had dreamed of seeing since I was old enough to understand what college even was. I had gotten in, early acceptance, full honors, the kind of deal that kids like me didn't just get handed unless they had fought tooth and nail for it, and I had fought harder than anyone. My grades had been perfect, my extracurriculars stacked, my essays sharp enough to cut through the competition. And now, after years of sacrificing sleep, a social life, and any sense of normal teenage rebellion, it had finally paid off. I practically sprinted inside, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as I grabbed my laptop, logging into the financial account that held my college fund, the money my mother had left me before she died, the money that had always been my safety net, my guarantee that I would never have to beg for scraps the way she had when she was alive. My fingers trembled as I typed in the login details, my excitement barely contained, my mind already racing ahead to the possibilities, the dorm rooms, the classes, the escape from this house and this life that had never quite felt like my own. And then, everything stopped. The balance on the screen wasn't what I expected. It wasn't even close. It should have been 5 figures, a number that had been steadily growing over the years, untouched except for the occasional deposit, always waiting, always there, a promise that no matter how hard things got, at least this one thing would never be taken away from me. But now, instead of that safety net, I was staring at an empty account, a zero staring back at me like an open grave, a black hole where my future used to be. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process it, refused to believe what I was seeing, convinced that it had to be some kind of mistake, a system error, a glitch that would correct itself if I just refreshed the page one more time. But no matter how many times I clicked, no matter how many times I logged in and out, the number didn't change, and the sick feeling crawling up my spine only got worse as reality started to set in. The money was gone. I sat there in stunned silence, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts, my hands gripping the sides of my laptop like I could somehow shake the truth out of it, like I could force the screen to give me a different answer. And then, without thinking, without even stopping to put on shoes, I stormed downstairs, my pulse roaring in my ears, my vision narrowing as I found exactly who I was looking for. My father, sitting on the couch like he had nothing better to do, flipping through channels with the lazy detachment of a man who had no idea that he had just destroyed his—
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
—son's entire future. Where is it? My voice came out sharper than I intended, the words laced with a panic I hadn't yet learned how to control, but I didn't care because I needed answers, and I needed them now. Steve barely looked up, his eyes flicking toward me with mild annoyance, as if I had interrupted something important, something more important than the fact that my entire life had just been ripped out from under me. "Where's what?" he muttered, scratching his jaw, his expression unreadable, but something about the way he said it made my stomach drop even further. I clenched my fists, my body shaking with the effort of holding myself together. "The college fund," I said, my voice tight, my chest heaving as I tried to breathe through the panic that was threatening to consume me. "The money Mom left for me. It's gone. Tell me you didn't." And then he did something that made my entire world tilt sideways, something so infuriating, so cruel, that I would never be able to forget the way it made my blood boil. He laughed. It wasn't loud, wasn't mocking, wasn't even particularly cruel. It was just a small, dismissive chuckle, like I had just asked him something ridiculous, something so beneath him that it wasn't even worth pretending to care about. "Oh, that," he said, waving a hand like it was nothing, like it was loose change he had spent on a cup of coffee instead of the money that had been meant to secure my future. "Yeah, I used it." The world around me seemed to slow, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs so hard it felt like it might break through, my hands curling into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. Ooh. "It," I repeated, my voice dangerously low, my vision blurring around the edges. "What the hell does that mean?" Steve shrugged, leaning back against the couch like he had all the time in the world. "Lisa needed a new car," he said casually, Like he was talking about something as simple as picking up groceries, like he hadn't just admitted to stealing from me without even a hint of remorse. So, I figured, why let that money sit there collecting dust when it could actually be put to good use? I felt my entire body lock up, every muscle going rigid, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts, my hands shaking with the sheer force of the rage that was clawing its way up my throat. "You stole my college fund to buy your wife a car?" The words barely made it out, my voice strangled, my chest so tight it felt like I might explode, but Steve just sighed, rubbing his temples like I was the one being unreasonable. "She's not just my wife, she's your stepmother," he said. His tone laced with that same condescending patience he always used when he was trying to make me feel like I was the one in the wrong. "And you'll figure something out. Kids these days get scholarships, take out loans, hell, get a job if you have to. You're smart, you'll manage." I stood there, staring at the man who had just stolen everything from me. The man who was supposed to protect me, supposed to have my back, supposed to care about something more than his own damn comfort. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Something dark and cold and entirely unrecognizable. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to cry, wasn't going to beg, wasn't going to scream at him like some helpless kid throwing a tantrum over something he couldn't change. No, I was going to make him pay. The rejection emails came one after another, each one delivering a fresh punch to the gut. A new reminder that no matter how hard I had worked, no matter how much I had sacrificed, no matter how much I deserved better than this, it didn't change the cold, unforgiving reality that my future had been stolen right out from under me. I had spent hours hunched over my laptop, my fingers numb from filling out applications, my eyes burning from reading through scholarship requirements that always seemed to have some ridiculous condition attached, only for every single response to tell me the same thing in different words. "We regret to inform you that due to limited funding, we are unable to offer you financial assistance at this time." I had tried everything, had looked into grants, had searched for emergency financial aid, had even considered begging the admissions office for some kind of mercy, but nothing changed the fact that without that money, I was stuck. The idea of loans crossed my mind more than once, but after running the numbers, it became painfully clear that without some kind of cosigner, without some kind of financial safety net, I would be buried in debt before I even had a chance to set foot on campus, and I refused to spend the rest of my life paying for something that was supposed to have already been mine. Meanwhile, Steve and Lisa acted as if nothing had happened, as if they weren't the reason my life was falling apart, as if the betrayal they had inflicted on me was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, something I should just get over like a bad grade or a missed curfew. Every time I walked downstairs, Lisa was there, lounging on the couch like a queen on her throne, scrolling through her phone, admiring pictures of the car that now sat in the driveway like a monument to my stolen dreams. The sleek, black luxury SUV, shining under the sun, practically mocking me every time I stepped outside. Its leather seats worth more than the tuition I could no longer afford, its existence a slap in the face every time I had to pass it on my way to nowhere. Steve, on the other hand, acted as if we had simply had a minor disagreement, as if the anger radiating off me was just some childish tantrum that would eventually pass, as if I would eventually realize that he had done what was best and come crawling back with gratitude instead of resentment. He still had the audacity to talk to me about responsibility, still had the nerve to make comments about how I needed to figure things out, still had the gall to sit at the dinner table like nothing had changed while I sat there in silence, my stomach twisting with the kind of rage that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. Then one night I heard her laugh. I had been in the kitchen, standing in the dim light of the refrigerator, staring blankly at a half-empty carton of milk, my mind so clouded with frustration that I wasn't even really seeing what was in front of me. I had barely heard the voices coming from the living room at first, barely registered the low murmur of Lisa talking to someone on the phone, until her words cut through the air like a blade, sharp, cruel, dripping with amusement. "Oh my God, you should have seen his face," she said, her voice light, almost sing-song, like this was all just a joke, like my entire life was nothing more than some cheap entertainment for her. He actually thought that money was his. I mean, seriously, Steve and I were crying from laughing so hard after he stormed off. Something inside me snapped, something deep, something that had been building for weeks, something that had been coiling tighter and tighter with every insult, every dismissive shrug, every condescending glance, and now, with those words, it finally broke loose. My fingers tightened around the fridge door handle, my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath coming short and sharp as the realization hit me harder than any of the rejection letters ever could. This wasn't just carelessness, wasn't just selfishness, wasn't even just betrayal. This was cruelty. This was deliberate. They had never intended for me to have that money, had never planned on letting me use it for college, had never even considered what it meant to take it away from me. It had never been about needing the money, never been about making a hard choice. It had been about control, about power, about making sure that I stayed exactly where they wanted me, beneath them, dependent on them, forced to live on their terms while they spent my future on leather seats and high-end rims. I let go of the fridge door, my hands shaking with a fury so intense I could barely breathe, barely think, barely hold myself together as the truth settled into my bones like ice. I had spent weeks trying to fix things, trying to find a way around this, trying to salvage my future like some desperate kid who still believed that the world was fair, that justice existed, that hard work actually meant something. I had spent sleepless nights convincing myself that if I just kept pushing, just kept trying, just kept searching for some way out, I could still make it work. But I had been wrong. There was no fixing this. There was no way out. No one was coming to help me. And that's when it hit me, sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos in my mind like a sudden bolt of lightning in the middle of a storm. If justice wasn't going to come for them, then I was going to be justice. I wasn't going to beg for what was already mine. I wasn't going to sit back and watch them enjoy the spoils of their theft while I scrambled for crumbs. I wasn't going to let them win. I turned away from the kitchen, my footsteps silent as I moved toward the stairs, my heart still pounding but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. My thoughts no longer circling in endless frustration but instead locking into something cold, something sharp, something dangerous. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, didn't have every detail worked out, didn't have a perfect plan ready to set in motion. But I knew one thing for sure. They had taken everything from me, laughed in my face, treated my loss as nothing more than a joke. And now, they were about to learn the one lesson they had never expected. I wasn't someone they should have underestimated. Lying awake in my room, staring at the ceiling as the dim glow of my laptop screen flickered against the walls, I let the anger settle into something colder, something sharper, something far more dangerous than the blind rage that had nearly consumed me before. This wasn't just about getting back at Steve anymore, wasn't just about making Lisa choke on her own laughter. This was about taking control, about making sure that they didn't just regret what they had done but understood, down to their very core, that they had made the worst mistake of their lives by underestimating me. I had spent years being the good son, the one who never talked back, never questioned, never made things difficult, the one who did what was expected, who believed in fairness, who thought hard work would always be rewarded. But that version of me had died the second I heard Lisa's voice dripping with amusement over the fact that I had actually believed the money my mother left for me was still mine. If they wanted to treat me like I was insignificant, like I was nothing more than an obstacle to be stepped over, then fine. I would make sure that the next step they took was straight off a cliff. Pulling up my father's company website, I started digging, scrolling through years of financial reports, public records, news articles. Anything that might tell me more about the business he had always loved more than he had ever loved me. Steve liked to act like he was invincible, like his success was untouchable, like nothing could ever shake the little empire he had built for himself. But the deeper I went, the more cracks I started to see beneath the polished surface. He wasn't as rich as he pretended to be, wasn't nearly as secure as he liked to make everyone believe, and judging by the desperate push for a new investor he had been hinting at over the last few months, I realized something that changed everything. He was already standing on shaky ground, already teetering on the edge of a fall he couldn't afford to take. I needed more, though, needed details that weren't just surface level, needed something concrete, something I could use, something that could be the key to tearing everything down. And there was only one person who might have exactly what I needed. Someone who had spent years watching Steve from a distance with nothing but contempt in her eyes. Aunt Linda. Linda had never liked my father, had never hidden her disgust for him even when my mother was still alive, had never bought into the charm he used so effortlessly on everyone else. After my mother died, she had tried to stay involved in my life, had fought to keep me close, but Steve had always made it clear that she wasn't welcome, that her presence was a problem, that she was a reminder of the woman he had moved on from far too easily. When I called her, she answered on the second ring, her voice cautious at first, like she wasn't sure if I was reaching out because I needed something or if this was some kind of trick orchestrated by my father. But the second I told her what had happened, the second I told her what Steve had done, the money he had stolen, the way he had thrown my future away like it was nothing, she went silent for a moment, and then I heard her exhale, slow and sharp, like she had been waiting for this moment for years. "I always knew he'd pull something like this," she said finally. Her voice steady but filled with something dark, something that told me she had been keeping secrets, waiting for the right time to use them. "You want to know the truth about Steve. You want to know what he's really been hiding." I leaned forward, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. "Tell me everything." And she did. Steve had made a deal about a year ago, a risky investment that had been supposed to bring in huge returns, a shortcut to an even bigger payday, something that would let him coast into a life of even greater luxury. But things hadn't gone the way he planned, the deal had started to crumble, and now he was scrambling, patching the cracks with borrowed money, convincing everyone around him that everything was fine when, in reality, one wrong move would bring the entire house of cards crashing down. I hung up with Linda after nearly an hour, my mind spinning, my body vibrating with something that wasn't just adrenaline but something more, something deeper, something that felt a lot like power. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one drowning. I was the one holding the rope, deciding whether or not to pull someone else under with me. But I wasn't done yet. I needed more, needed something that would rip apart Steve's personal life just as much as his financial one, needed to make sure that Lisa, the woman who had laughed at my suffering, paid just as steep a price for thinking she could get away with it. That's when I called Emily, the only person I trusted, the only person who knew me well enough to understand that whatever I was about to do, there was no talking me out of it. "Do me a favor," I said as soon as she answered, skipping any kind of small talk because there wasn't time for that. "Help me find out everything about Lisa's past." Emily didn't even hesitate. "You thinking what I think you're thinking? If what I suspect is true," I said, my voice steady, my heartbeat loud in my ears, "then Lisa isn't just a gold digger, she's a walking disaster waiting to happen." Emily spent the next 2 days pulling every record, every article, every scrap of information she could find, and what she uncovered was exactly what I had hoped for. Lisa had a past that Steve had never bothered to look into, a past filled with debts, with suspicious relationships, with an ex-husband who had accused her of draining his accounts dry before vanishing without a trace. She had a pattern, a history of latching onto men with money, using them for everything they had, then moving on the second things got inconvenient. The pieces were falling into place, the plan forming in my mind like a masterpiece waiting to be completed, every detail sharpening with each new revelation. I didn't just want to hurt them, didn't just want to watch them suffer. I wanted to erase them, wanted to make sure that by the time I was finished, they wouldn't even have scraps left to hold on to. Steve had stolen my future. Lisa had laughed at my pain. And now, they were about to learn that they had created the one enemy they couldn't afford to have. The moment I found out about Greg Wilson, I knew I had everything I needed to push my father straight into the abyss he had been so desperately trying to avoid. Greg wasn't just some investor looking for a safe place to park his money. He was a businessman with a reputation for being ruthless, a man who had built his empire by sniffing out weakness and exploiting it before his competition even knew what was happening. If there was anyone who could take Steve's already shaky financial situation and turn it into a full-blown disaster, it was Greg Wilson, and all I had to do was make sure he got the right information at the right time. I spent hours digging through financial reports, cross-referencing everything Linda had told me with what was publicly available, making sure that every single detail was airtight, leaving no room for doubt, no way for Steve to explain away the damage once it started spreading. His company had been running on borrowed time for months, propped up by risky investments and bad decisions that looked fine on the surface but were rotting underneath, and all it would take was a small push in the right direction to make sure it all came crashing down. That push came in the form of an anonymous email, carefully crafted, designed to look like an inside tip from someone on the inside. Someone who had seen the cracks forming, someone who wanted to warn a potential investor before they made a massive mistake. I created a fake identity, a former employee who had concerns about Steve's business practices, and attached just enough documentation to make sure Greg didn't just dismiss it as a smear campaign. It wasn't a lie, not even close, because every single piece of information I gave him was true, but the trick was making sure it looked like something that had accidentally landed in his hands rather than something that had been placed there on purpose. The moment I hit send, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, watching the little confirmation message pop up on the screen, knowing that I had just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. But I wasn't finished yet. Taking down Steve's business was only half of the plan, because while he was busy scrambling to put out fires he didn't even know had been started, I needed Lisa to start questioning everything, to start seeing cracks where there weren't any, to start doubting the very man she had attached herself to like a leech. She had always been about the money, about the status, about the comfort of knowing she had secured her place in a life that didn't require actual effort, and the second she started believing that Steve wasn't as rich or stable as he pretended to be, she would do exactly what I needed her to, start looking for a way out. It started small, just little comments here and there, little whispers planted at just the right moments, subtle enough that they wouldn't seem suspicious but direct enough that they would start to sink in. "You know, Lisa," I said one evening, leaning casually against the kitchen counter while she sipped her overpriced imported wine, "it's actually kind of weird how secretive Dad's been about his money lately. You ever notice that?" She raised an eyebrow, glancing up from her phone, her expression carefully neutral, but I knew that I had her attention the second her fingers hesitated over the screen. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp but controlled, the tone of someone who didn't like surprises, especially when they had the potential to affect her. I shrugged, keeping my expression lazy, uninterested, as if this was nothing more than casual conversation, as if I wasn't carefully orchestrating every single word. I mean, just little things, I said, letting the words roll off my tongue slowly, deliberately, like I wasn't even thinking about them. Phone calls he takes in the other room, emails he closes the second someone walks by. Weird tension every time finances come up. Could be nothing, obviously, but I don't know. Just seems like a guy who might not be telling his wife everything. I saw the way her posture shifted, the way her jaw tightened slightly, the way she forced a small, amused smile like she was brushing it off, but I knew her well enough by now to see the way her mind was already racing, already pulling up every single moment that might have seemed suspicious in hindsight. By the time she left the kitchen, pretending she wasn't affected, I knew that she was already considering the possibility, already thinking about what it would mean if Steve was hiding something, already wondering if she had made a mistake trusting him so blindly. And just like that, the first crack had been made. Over the next few days, I kept the pressure steady but subtle, making sure to drop just enough hints to keep her on edge but never enough to make her outright confront Steve. I let her sit with the doubt, let it grow, let it fester into something that felt real, into something that she wouldn't be able to ignore even if she wanted to. I could see it working in the way she started watching him more closely, in the way her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, in the way she hesitated before answering his questions, like she was already preparing for the moment she might have to lie to him. And then the best part happened. Steve, in his arrogance, in his absolute belief that he was always one step ahead, unknowingly walked straight into the trap I had spent weeks setting for him. It started with a call from Greg Wilson, a call that Steve had been expecting to go very differently. A call that should have ended with a handshake and a contract but instead ended with Greg coldly informing him that he would not be moving forward with any investments due to serious concerns about financial stability. I watched from the staircase as Steve slammed his phone onto the kitchen table. His face pale, his hands shaking slightly, the first real crack of panic I had ever seen on him beginning to form. Lisa, sitting across from him, swirling her wine in a way that almost looked bored, barely even glanced up as she said, "Funny, I heard something about that the other day." Steve froze, turning to look at her, suspicion flashing across his face so quickly that I almost laughed at how perfectly this was all coming together. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he snapped, his voice sharper than usual, the stress already getting to him. Lisa just shrugged, her lips curling slightly, the seed of doubt now fully taking root. "Just that people talk," she said, her voice smooth, careless, dripping with just enough condescension to make sure he knew that she knew something, even if she didn't. "And maybe I should have asked a few more questions before marrying a man who might not be as financially stable as he likes to act." The way Steve's entire body tensed, the way his fingers clenched around the edge of the table, the way his expression flickered between anger and fear, told me everything I needed to know. He had no idea where the hit had come from. No idea that this wasn't just bad luck or a miscalculation but a carefully planned destruction, orchestrated by the very person he had believed he could steal from without consequence. I slipped back upstairs before either of them noticed me, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming fast and sharp, my mind racing with the realization that for the first time since this had all started, I wasn't the one losing. For the first time I was winning. And the best part, Steve still had no idea that I was the one holding the match, waiting for the perfect moment to burn his entire world to the ground. The first sign that things were finally unraveling came in the form of Steve's barely contained frustration, the kind of anger that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode, the kind that turned his usually arrogant demeanor into something rigid and unstable. I had been watching him carefully, studying his every move, noting the way his shoulders tensed whenever he checked his phone, the way his jaw clenched just a little tighter each time he opened his laptop, the way his fingers drummed anxiously against the kitchen counter whenever he thought no one was paying attention. He was waiting for something, expecting news that wasn't coming, hoping for a lifeline that had already been cut before he even realized it was slipping through his fingers. And then it happened. I had been in the living room, flipping through an old book, pretending to be completely uninterested in whatever disaster was brewing in the background when I heard the phone ring, sharp and shrill, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. I knew before he even answered that it was Greg Wilson, knew that this was the call Steve had been dreading, knew that the moment he picked up, everything would start to come crashing down around him. "Greg," Steve said, his voice steady but forced, the kind of forced calm that only came from a man desperately trying to pretend he was still in control. "I was just about to." He stopped mid-sentence, his expression shifting so fast it was almost comical, his eyes narrowing, his grip tightening around the phone like he could physically stop whatever was about to happen. "What do you mean you're pulling out?" I sat completely still, barely breathing, watching as the reality of the situation settled over him like a storm cloud, watching as his face drained of color, as his free hand curled into a fist, as he struggled to keep his voice level while the world he had built on stolen money and empty promises started to collapse beneath him. "No, Greg, listen," he said, his voice dropping into something almost pleading, something I had never heard from him before. "This is a mistake, we're still solid, the numbers look bad now, but once we—" Another pause, another flicker of panic in his eyes, another sign that whatever Greg was saying wasn't just a simple inconvenience but a death sentence. "Who told you that?" I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling, knowing exactly who had told Greg, knowing that every piece of information had been carefully placed in his hands by me, knowing that no matter how hard Steve tried to claw his way out of this, the damage had already been done. "Greg, come on, don't do this," he said, his voice slipping further into desperation, his entire body tense with the kind of panic that only came from realizing that for the first time he was the one at a disadvantage. "We've been partners for years, you know this company, you know me, you know I wouldn't." Another long silence, another crushing moment of realization, another piece of his arrogance breaking apart right in front of me. "Greg, wait, let's talk about this." The call ended abruptly, and Steve stood there for a long moment, staring at his phone like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened, like if he just stood still long enough, reality would somehow reset itself and give him a different answer. But nothing changed, and when he finally slammed the phone down onto the counter, the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, sharp and final, a declaration that for the first time in his life, he had lost. Lisa, who had been sitting at the dining table pretending to scroll through her phone, glanced up at him with a carefully neutral expression. Her lips pressed together, her fingers stilling over the screen like she was debating whether or not to say what was already written all over her face. "Something wrong, Steve?" she asked, her voice laced with just enough amusement to make it clear that she had already guessed the answer. Steve turned to her, his face tight, his eyes flashing with something close to fury, but before he could even open his mouth, she continued, her tone light, almost lazy, like she was enjoying watching him squirm. "Because I have to admit, I have been wondering about a few things lately," she said, tilting her head slightly, studying him like he was some kind of puzzle she was just now realizing was missing a few pieces. "Like why you've been so tense about money all of a sudden." I didn't even bother hiding my smirk as Steve's head snapped toward her, his jaw tightening, his entire body shifting like he was preparing for a fight he hadn't even realized he was walking into. Lisa wasn't stupid, and while she might have been content to ignore the warning signs before, now that things weren't looking as stable as she had once believed, she was going to start digging, and once she started, she wasn't going to stop until she found exactly what she was looking for. "You think I'm hiding something?" Steve snapped, crossing his arms over his chest like that would somehow make him look more in control, but Lisa just raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into something sharp, something knowing, something dangerous. "I don't think anything," she said smoothly, leaning back in her chair, tapping her nails against the table in slow, deliberate movements. "But maybe I'll just take a closer look, you know, since you don't seem too eager to explain anything yourself." Steve opened his mouth, then closed it again, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression that I had never seen before. Uncertainty, the realization that he wasn't just fighting a business failure anymore, but a war on two fronts. And that was exactly what I wanted. But the best part, the part that made this whole thing even sweeter, he had no idea that I wasn't even finished yet. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, short and to the point, but enough to make my chest tighten with satisfaction. "Linda, he knows you're staying with me. He's pissed." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of everything shifting, feeling the control I had been chasing for so long finally settling into my hands, knowing that Steve was starting to realize that I wasn't just some bitter kid throwing a tantrum. I was the one pulling the strings now, the one deciding exactly how far he would fall. Because this was only the beginning. The sound of Lisa's heels clicking against the marble floor was the first thing I heard that morning, a sharp, deliberate rhythm that carried through the house like a countdown to something inevitable, something irreversible, something that had been set in motion long before Steve had even realized he was playing a game he was destined to lose. I was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to scroll through my phone, pretending that I didn't already know what was about to happen, pretending that this was just another morning in a house that was slowly being hollowed out from the inside. Steve was standing by the window, his back to both of us, his shoulders tense, his phone clenched so tightly in his hand that I half expected it to shatter under the pressure. He had been on edge for days, his temper shorter than ever, his patience worn thin by late-night phone calls and urgent meetings that never seemed to fix anything. His business slipping further and further out of his grasp no matter how hard he tried to hold on to it. He hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating much, hadn't been able to shake the creeping feeling that something was very, very wrong, and now, as Lisa crossed the room with an unreadable expression and a folder tucked neatly under her arm, he was about to find out exactly what that was. "Steve," she said, her voice smooth, almost too casual, like she was trying to soften the blow before she even delivered it. "We need to talk." I glanced up just in time to see Steve turn, his face tight. His eyes flicking from the folder in her hands to the set of divorce papers she pulled out without hesitation, laying them flat on the table like a well-played card in a losing hand. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, heavy and suffocating, stretching between them like a chasm that had been waiting to swallow him whole. Steve's jaw tensed, his hands clenching at his sides. His breath coming just a little too fast as he processed what he was looking at, as the reality of the situation started to sink in. "Lisa," he said. His voice low, dangerous, the kind of warning that had once been enough to make people back down. "What the hell is this?" Lisa sighed, tilting her head slightly, watching him like he was a problem she had already solved, like he was an inconvenience she was finally ready to be rid of. "It's exactly what it looks like," she said simply, tapping one manicured nail against the papers, her lips curving into something almost sympathetic, almost amused. "I'm filing for divorce." I expected Steve to explode, expected him to slam his fist against the table, expected him to lash out, to yell, to try to intimidate her into backing down the way he had done to so many others before. But instead, he just stared at her. His eyes flickering with something almost unreadable, something cold, something calculating, something that told me he was already trying to figure out how to turn this around, how to get back control of a situation that had long since slipped through his fingers. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice steadier now, quieter, the kind of voice he used when he wanted people to believe he still had the upper hand. "You're overreacting. Whatever's going on, we can fix this." Lisa let out a small laugh, shaking her head slightly, her fingers trailing lazily along the edge of the table as she leaned in just enough to make sure he saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. "Oh, Steve," she murmured, her voice dripping with condescension, with finality, with a kind of amusement that came from knowing she had already won. "You think I don't know about the money? About the missing investments? About the fact that you've been scrambling to fix problems you still won't admit to having?" Steve's expression faltered, just for a second, just long enough for Lisa to see it, just long enough for me to know that she had him exactly where she wanted him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, too quickly, the first crack in his carefully controlled mask finally starting to show. Lisa smirked, reaching into the folder and pulling out a stack of documents, flipping through them casually before sliding them across the table toward him. "I hired a forensic accountant," she said, watching as his face went pale, as his hands twitched at his sides, as the weight of what was happening finally started pressing down on him. "Turns out you aren't nearly as good at hiding things as you think you are." I had to fight the urge to laugh, had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from giving myself away. Had to stay completely still as I watched Steve come to terms with the fact that the wife he had so confidently stolen my future for was now tearing his apart with the same ease. Lisa pushed the papers closer, her smile widening just slightly as she saw the panic creeping into his expression. "Don't worry," she said sweetly, tilting her head slightly. "I'm not taking everything, just what I'm owed." Steve inhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly, his mind racing as he realized he was running out of options, as he realized that every single thing he had built was slipping away faster than he could stop it. And then, just when I thought the moment couldn't get any better, his phone buzzed against the counter, the screen lighting up with a name I had been waiting for, Greg Wilson. Steve snatched the phone up immediately, pressing it to his ear so fast he nearly dropped it. His voice raw, desperate, on the edge of something dangerously close to full-blown panic. "Greg," he said quickly, barely sparing Lisa a glance as she crossed her arms over her chest and waited, knowing this call wasn't going to save him. "Listen, I don't know what you think you heard, but..." I didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation to know exactly what was being said, didn't need to be in the room to know that Greg had finally decided to go public with the information I had fed him, didn't need to see Steve's face to know that the last nail had just been driven into the coffin of everything he had worked so hard to protect. Lisa watched him for a moment, then sighed, pushing back from the table, grabbing her purse without another word. "I'll have my lawyer send over the final details," she said, adjusting her sunglasses as she turned toward the door, her voice still as calm and collected as ever. "Oh, and Steve." Steve barely glanced at her, his face pale, his body stiff, His grip on the phone so tight his knuckles were turning white. Lisa smiled, almost pitying, almost mocking. "Enjoy your new reality," she said, and then she was gone, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. I waited a few seconds, letting it all settle in, letting Steve sit there with the weight of everything collapsing around him. And then, finally, I stood, stepping forward, making sure he saw me, making sure he knew I had been there the whole time. When he looked at me, his expression twisted into something unreadable, something close to fury but not quite, something lost, something broken, something that told me he was finally starting to understand. "You," he breathed, realization dawning. His voice shaking with something close to rage. I smiled, slow, deliberate, letting the moment stretch before finally speaking. "Yeah, Dad," I said, tilting my head slightly, letting him see exactly what this was, exactly what I had done. It was me. The classified ad for Lisa's SUV went up before the divorce papers were even finalized. A desperate attempt by Steve to scrape together whatever money he could from the wreckage of his life, clinging to the last remnants of a world he no longer controlled. The listing itself was almost laughable, filled with carefully chosen words meant to make it sound like he was selling it by choice, like it wasn't a fire sale, like he wasn't standing at the edge of financial ruin with nowhere left to turn. Luxury vehicle, pristine condition, one owner, price to sell quickly. The phrasing was as hollow as his bank account, and judging by the number of times I saw him refreshing the listing, it was clear that buyers weren't exactly lining up to take the burden off his hands. I had watched the slow unraveling of his life with a quiet kind of satisfaction, not the fiery, all-consuming vengeance I had once expected to feel, but something deeper, something colder, something far more final. It wasn't just about watching him lose. It was about watching him understand that there was no one coming to save him, no one left to bail him out, no one willing to play the role of the fool the way he had so often expected. The empire he had built on arrogance and stolen opportunities had collapsed in on itself. And now, with Lisa gone and his business in ruins, all he had left were regrets that came far too late to matter. I had heard the fight before she left, the sharp, cutting tone of Lisa's voice carrying through the house as she packed her things, each word laced with bitterness, with resentment, with the realization that the man she had hitched her future to had nothing left to offer her. "I didn't marry you to live like this, Steve," she had spat, the sound of drawers slamming punctuating her words, her footsteps sharp and unforgiving as she moved through the house. "You promised me stability, security, a life worth staying for. And now you can't even afford to keep the damn car you bought me." Steve had tried to reason with her. His voice strained, desperate, slipping into the same smooth talking charm that had once worked so easily, the same voice he had used to manipulate, to control, to bend people to his will. But Lisa wasn't interested in empty words anymore, wasn't swayed by the promises of a man who had already lost everything, wasn't willing to stick around and drown alongside him just to prove a point. She had gotten what she wanted, had drained him dry, had squeezed every last drop of value from their marriage. And now, like the opportunist she had always been, she was walking away without a second glance. The door slammed behind her, the sound final, echoing through the empty house like a closing chapter, like a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on for too long. I had waited a few minutes before stepping out of my room, taking my time, letting the silence settle before making my way downstairs, finding Steve sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. His phone still clutched in his grip. His entire body weighed down by the reality of what had just happened. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't say a single word as I walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter, watching him, waiting for him to break the silence first. "She left," he said finally, his voice hollow, his fingers tightening around his phone like he was still trying to convince himself that this wasn't real, that this wasn't happening, that there was some way to fix what had already been destroyed. I took a slow sip of water, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of everything he had lost settle over him before finally responding. "Yeah," I said, my voice even, my expression unreadable. "She did." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with one hand. His body slumped forward in a way that made him look smaller, older, like the weight of his own actions had finally caught up to him after years of outrunning the consequences. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like the untouchable, overconfident man who had spent years making me feel like I was nothing more than an afterthought. He just looked tired, defeated, like a man who had finally realized that he had burned every bridge without ever bothering to look back. "I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to me, shaking his head slightly, his fingers tapping absently against the table, his mind still grasping for some kind of explanation that made sense to him. "I did everything right. I built this from nothing. I gave her everything. I gave you." He stopped abruptly, his eyes flicking up to meet mine, something unreadable flashing across his face, something dangerously close to realization. I tilted my head slightly, arching an eyebrow, watching as the pieces started to click together in his mind, watching as he finally began to understand what he had been too blind to see before. "You," he breathed, his voice suddenly sharper. His posture shifting as he sat up straighter, as his mind started racing, as he connected the dots he should have seen long ago. "You did this." I didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't deny it. "Yeah," I said simply, setting my water bottle down on the counter, folding my arms across my chest, letting him see the truth in my expression, letting him see that I wasn't just some bitter kid acting out in anger. I was the architect of his downfall, the one who had carefully, methodically, and patiently dismantled everything he had once believed was unshakable. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly, a humorless laugh escaping his lips, something bitter, something almost impressed in a way that made my stomach twist. "You really did it," he murmured, his eyes scanning my face, searching for something, maybe regret, maybe hesitation, maybe some sign that I had second thoughts. "You tore it all down." I exhaled slowly, letting his words hang in the air before nodding once. "I did," I admitted, my voice steady, my resolve unwavering. "Because you deserved it." For a long moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. His mind still processing the reality of what had happened, the depth of what I had done, the realization that the son he had dismissed, the son he had stolen from, the son he had underestimated, had been the one to deliver the final blow. And then, just as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, glancing at the screen, my chest tightening slightly as I read the words that changed everything. "Congratulations. You've been awarded a full-ride academic scholarship." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the phone, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of my lips as I realized what this truly meant. I had never needed Steve's stolen money to begin with. I turned back to him, watching as he sat there, broken, defeated, the weight of his own choices pressing down on him like a mountain he could never climb. "I never needed you," I said quietly, my voice filled with something final, something absolute. "And now you have nothing left to take." And with that I walked away, leaving him alone in the ruins of the life he had built, knowing that for the first time, he finally understood exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The knock at my door was slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that carried a weight far heavier than the wood it landed against, the kind of sound that didn't just ask for attention, it demanded it. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door like it might disappear if I waited long enough, like if I just ignored it, the past wouldn't come creeping back into my life, wouldn't find its way into the quiet, steady future I had finally started building for myself. But the knocking didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't waver, and deep down, I already knew who was standing on the other side. Already knew that there was only one person left who would come searching for me now that he had nowhere else to go. I took a slow breath, my fingers curling around the doorknob, my pulse steady but slow, my mind racing through every possible version of this conversation, every way it could end, every choice I could make. And then, finally, I pulled the door open, my expression unreadable, my posture relaxed, my heart cold as I looked into the tired, sunken eyes of the man who had once stolen everything from me. Steve looked different now, smaller somehow. His shoulders no longer squared with arrogance. His clothes wrinkled in a way that told me he hadn't been sleeping much. His face lined with something that almost looked like regret but not quite deep enough to be real. He had always been the kind of man who moved through life like nothing could touch him, like the consequences of his actions would never catch up, like the world would always bend to his will if he pushed hard enough. But now, standing in front of me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a jacket that had seen better days, his gaze flickering with something dangerously close to desperation, I saw him for exactly what he was. A man who had spent his whole life taking from others, only to realize too late that there was nothing left for him to steal. "Nick," he said, his voice rough, quiet, almost cautious, like he wasn't sure how I would react, like he knew he was standing on a battlefield where he had already lost the war. "I need to talk to you." I didn't step aside, didn't invite him in, didn't offer him the smallest bit of comfort as I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest, letting him stand in the cold like the world had finally stopped making room for him. "What could we possibly have to talk about?" I asked, my voice even, controlled, absent of the anger I had once carried like a blade sharpened just for him. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair, his fingers trembling slightly, a small, almost imperceptible sign of just how far he had fallen. "I lost everything," he admitted, his eyes darting away from mine for a brief second, like he couldn't quite face the weight of his own downfall. The business, the house, the money. Lisa took whatever was left, and now I've got nothing. No job, no savings, no. He hesitated, his throat working as he swallowed hard, forcing the words out like they physically hurt him. No one. I stared at him, my expression unreadable, my mind carefully processing every syllable, every subtle shift in his stance, every flicker of emotion that passed across his face. I had imagined this moment so many times, had pictured every version of it, had rehearsed the words I might say, the things I might do, the ways I could make him feel just a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on me. But now that he was standing here, broken, stripped of the power he had once wielded so carelessly, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. I just felt nothing. You stole my future, I said simply, watching as his jaw tightened slightly, as his shoulders tensed, as the truth hit him with a force he couldn't ignore. You took everything I had and spent it on a woman who left you the second things got hard. And now you're standing here asking me for help. Steve flinched at the words, his hands tightening into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax, his pride still clinging to whatever scraps it could find. I made mistakes, he admitted, his voice quieter now, lacking the usual bravado, lacking the arrogance that had once defined him. I should've. He stopped himself, shaking his head slightly, exhaling as he forced himself to meet my gaze again. I should have been better. I let the silence stretch between us, let him sit with those words, let him finally feel the weight of the things he had done, the choices he had made, the bridges he had burned so thoroughly that there was nothing left to salvage. And then, just as I was about to respond, a voice from behind me cut through the moment, sharp and unwavering, filled with a certainty I hadn't realized I needed to hear. Close the door, Nick. I didn't have to turn to know it was Aunt Linda, her presence steady, grounding, reminding me that I had a choice, reminding me that I didn't owe this man a damn thing. Men like him don't change, she continued, stepping closer. Her eyes locked onto Steve with a look that could have shattered glass. He's not here because he's sorry. He's here because he has nowhere else to go. Steve's face twisted slightly, not with anger but with something close to shame, because he knew she was right, knew that there was no real apology waiting behind his words, knew that he was standing here not because he wanted to fix things but because he had run out of options. And then, as if the universe had decided I needed to hear both sides, Emily's voice joined the conversation, softer, quieter, but no less firm. Revenge can only take you so far, Nick, she said, her eyes searching mine, her expression careful, thoughtful, knowing exactly what was at stake. At some point, you have to decide if winning is worth carrying this with you for the rest of your life. I inhaled slowly, letting both of their words settle, letting the weight of the moment press down on me, letting the past and the present collide in a way that forced me to see the truth I had been avoiding. I had spent so long chasing this, had spent so long making sure he lost, had spent so long tearing him down, but now that I had all the power, now that I was the one in control, now that I had everything he had once taken from me and more, I had to ask myself what I really wanted. I turned back to Steve, staring at him for a long moment, watching as he stood there, waiting, hoping, knowing that his fate rested entirely in my hands. And then, with one final breath, I made my choice. Final question. When the person who destroyed you begs for mercy, do you give it, or walk away?